Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mary Collins, and I'm the director of the BC Healthy Living Alliance, and we're so pleased that you all joined us today. I gather there are those from all around the province and some from outside the province as well, and we're very excited about the presentations we're going to hear today in our webinar, See Jane Thrive, Lessons for Healthier Early Childhood Development. We're going to look at research and models and show how successful partnerships can have a positive impact on early childhood development. I'm going to tell you more about the program shortly, but just before we get rolling, there are a few housekeeping items. First of all, if you have trouble hearing me or the presenters, just try turning up the volume on your phone or computer. And of course, we really want your input today, so we're going to be asking you to use the control panel on the right-hand corner of your screen. There you can type in your questions for our speakers as you think of them at any time, and we'll be having a question period after each speaker. We also want you to participate in some polls. We'll give you a heads up that the poll is coming, and then you'll see a blue screen that has multiple choice questions. Please respond to the polls. You'll have a few seconds to do so, and then we'll announce the results for everyone to see. The polls provide us and our panelists and you with instant feedback. Again, we really want your questions and comments, and you can submit them at any time during the presentation or after. Just simply type them in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. And also indicate if there's someone in particular that you're addressing your question or comment to. We'll certainly answer as many questions as we have time for, and if we miss any, we'll send out a post-event email with any missed questions and answers. So that's the sort of housekeeping, and let me turn now to our program. It's often said that it takes a village to raise a child, and this is definitely true when we look at creating conditions for healthy early child development. The early years are critical. They establish a foundation, and they influence the trajectory of a child's future health and well-being. So today we're going to hear about the latest research, as well as Canadian and international examples of what can be done to promote health in the early years, including partnerships in British Columbia communities. Our first speaker is Joseph Dunn, and he's the Provincial Director of Success by Six. He will describe how collaboration can strengthen supports for young children and help to make communities more family-friendly. In the second presentation, UBC faculty member Dr. Mariana Bressoni will explain the latest research on risky play and what the current thinking is on how to strike a balance between injury prevention and healthy child development. And our final presentation will feature Dr. P.J. Naylor from the University of Victoria. Drawing from lessons in Canada and around the world, she will discuss how to create environments that make it easier for young children to eat healthy and be active. So again, we've left time for a discussion at the end of each presentation, and we encourage you to ask questions. Now, before we get started, we'd just like to start with a question about you, all our participants. And we're going to put up a poll, and we'll ask you if you just indicate which statement best describes your interest in today's topic. If you fit into more than one category, just choose the one that you think fits best today while you're joining us today. We'll give you a few seconds to do that. Just waiting for, and it looks like, well, 51% say all of the above, and then 22% collaboration for early childhood development, with others having other interests as well. So again, we're just delighted. We've had over 200 people register for this webinar, so it's very exciting. Let us proceed now with our first speaker, Joseph Dunn. Joseph is the Provincial Director of the Success by Six initiative in British Columbia. And Success by Six is focused on supporting community-based planning and programming to foster early childhood development in communities across the province. So welcome, Joseph, and please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you so much. And welcome everyone this morning. So what I am going to be talking about is giving you a broad overview of what the Success by Six initiative looks like in BC, and then moving from there slowly into what are the key components of early years community development. Its focus on prevention in the early years, and from there providing you with just some beautiful examples of what that looks like across the province right now. So to begin, Success by Six is a partnership, and it's a partnership on many different levels. So if we move to our first slide, we are a combination of United Ways, credit unions, Ministries of Children and Family Development, and Aboriginal community leaders. If we could advance to the first slide, please. This initiative is dedicated to ensuring that children ages 0 to 6 have access to resources and programs that support their healthy growth and development, and necessarily that involves their families, the parents involved as well. It builds community through engaging citizens, and that brings the broad cross-section of a community in building child and family-friendly communities. And you may say, well, that seems like a tough goal, but that is why this partnership that's in place is so critical, because some of that family-friendly community piece isn't really something available to the early years sector in itself. And that's where our credit union partners and their leadership they bring in terms of the business community is so critical. The program also funds programs that include literacy, nutrition, children's play, parenting, family skills, general development, and many more. The whole aspect that is critical to this community development initiative is responding to the particular needs of a community, and in that way it's a very community-based model of community development. Next slide, please. So what that looks like in terms of the vision of Success by Six is 550 communities across the province who are being supported and participating in this model. So since 2003, the initiative has been expanding across the province in regions, in large and small communities, trying to affect this change and to support it. So this envisions where all children are healthy, safe, and secure. And you can imagine by the title, Success by Six, we're looking forward to the idea of children who are entering kindergarten to be ready and able to succeed for the rest of their lives. The particular goals in British Columbia are to build this community capacity, to build that web of supports and services and this comprehensive range of early childhood development services around families, to mobilize and leverage resources towards creating a much more accessible and comprehensive range of ECD services to children and families, and very critically, to bring in those other voices in the community to raise awareness about the importance of the early years and increase public support for ECD as a community, a provincial, as a national priority. So that's the piece of advocacy and public awareness. So to move on, when we're thinking about how we are going to accomplish this, we realized that this community development model needed to be very particular to the early years. It's based on the belief that all sectors critically need to be involved and mobilized to support children's early years. And that means cross-sectoral and cross-cultural community collaboration, and I'll get to that cultural piece in a moment. Success by Six's community-based partnership is based upon a model that's been happening in the United States for well over 20 years and has been radiating across Canada in its own variations for the last 15 years. It is a community-based cross-sectoral partnership, and what that means is that organizations are part of a common vision. And as I mentioned, that is one that children are ready to succeed when they enter school, and that their families are supported in helping them to get to that place. So it is very specific in that manner. Success by Six is rooted in the principle that a community working together towards a common vision is much more effective than programs that are determined from someplace else, that it is much more effective to improve outcomes for children if there is that common vision of how to go about it. And that is the network of services, that is the integration of services, that is finding systems to support families. In addition to being community-based and outcome-driven, the model is focused on prevention. And as I think you'll be hearing from our other speakers this morning, that prevention is the key in the early years, and prevention requires awareness and education in order to address it. In our next slide, we can see that there is a model in place, and it is really the unique quality of having four partners from different aspects of our society. The partners that I mentioned, credit unions of BC, have a role of working within communities with local initiatives, and the model there is that there are early years planning tables that are in place in all communities across the province. The credit unions bring the business sector into that conversation. They are a liaison to another aspect of the community. The United Ways of BC leverage their experience in community development and their relationships with the leadership of the community. The Ministry of Children and Family Development are a significant funder and who play an active role through regional leadership in our planning tables, and our Aboriginal leaders and partners who represent the critical place of ensuring that the Aboriginal voice is made present and loud in all of our decision making. With our next slide, just to go into a little bit more depth about our Aboriginal partnership and why this is so central to the initiative. It is guided by an Aboriginal engagement strategy that was developed in 2006, and it outlines 4 key priorities of our initiative that are central to everything that we do. So in these early years tables that are in place, there is a desire to increase Aboriginal participation and representation in the initiative. What this means is making sure that in these communities, whether it is through Aboriginal service providers, elders, leaders, bands, and council, the voice of Aboriginal community development of the early years sector is being received and being heard in that planning process. Our second key priority is to work with Aboriginal communities to strengthen community capacity building around the early years, to find those champions for children, and to support them in their work of advocacy. And thirdly, to increase cultural awareness within the context of Aboriginal ECD. And what that is referring to is cultural safety and awareness in the wide breadth of early years programs by ensuring that service providers are informed and able to deal with the cultural needs and are sensitive to the cultural needs of Aboriginal families. And finally, to promote and increase awareness of the importance of ECD across the province and across communities, but particularly within Aboriginal communities. The strategy is designed to promote the development of partnerships, relationships, and collaboration across cultures and communities to support Aboriginal children and their families. And as I mentioned, this is a particular aspect of our initiative, which is key to all elements of what the initiative is doing across the province. Next slide, please. So to give you an example of what this looks like, because as I was saying, this is a model that takes place on the larger perspective of the province, but it happens in every region and in every community. And how this looks like is that communities come together, they're recognizing what their needs are, what the gaps are in services, and they are planning. They're referring to research, critically the Early Development Instrument that is provided by our partners at the Human Early Learning Partnership. They're taking that information, they're realizing what's necessary to really create an integrated system of services. They're figuring out what are those key gaps and who are those key populations within their communities that need particular support, and they're recognizing what are the universal points of access that families need to be supported in ensuring that their children have healthy development. So a particular example of that is in the boundary area of the province. So if you're not too familiar with that, that's right down by the border at the southern part of the province, the southern central. And in this particular community, there was a recognition that there was a real need to have a culturally significant program for families and with their young children. So over the course of a year, 12 children's drumming circles were held throughout this region. What's significant about this partnership is it brought together such diverse aspects of the early years sector, bringing Strong Start centers and the school district, the Boundary Child Care Resource and Referral, so the child care community, the Baby's Best Chance program, so a national, a federal funded program, trying to work with these other resources and public health, and the Boundary Métis Community Association. So with these particular, and sorry, I should have mentioned as well that the Public Health Agency of Canada is what I was referring to as another partner. Each of these drumming circles incorporated traditional songs and the use of personal hand drums, as well as a larger children's community circle, drum. The circles began with an opening round using a traditional talking stick, and Aboriginal stories were shared both orally and using picture books. So what was going on here is both cultural awareness of the service providers who were coming together in a partnership around this particular program, as well as an opportunity to connect families both with culture, with a network and a community, and to these resources and services that may not have been already an awareness to them that existed. To move on, another wonderful example is if we look to Powell River up the Sunshine Coast, a wonderful partnership, a cross-sectoral partnership bringing together the United Way in that community with Success by Six planning, contributions from local credit unions and business, and critically bringing into that conversation volunteers from the community, in this case seniors, who are responsible for driving a bus, which is in many communities recognized as a great way to provide outreach to families who would otherwise not be able to access services. So this bus goes around throughout and across the Powell River area, from little community one to the next, sometimes getting on ferries to get out to the most rural areas. And it provides early learning, public health access, so early screening opportunities to these families that would otherwise not be able to come to the programs where these services are offered. The goal is to build community relationships, to partner with the diverse organizations and businesses who are brought on board as supporters of the bus, and it builds both awareness and a real commitment to the families of the community. And finally, one more example, and this is a particular case on Vancouver Island, and in this situation, it's a program called Hop With Me. If we could advance that slide, please. And each summer long, what's happening there is that programs for preschool children, as you could imagine from your work in the early years, things start to slow down as they are right now. Programs come to a close before starting up in September. And there was a clear recognition that this was a gap for the community. So a program came to life called Hop With Me in the Comox Valley. So this was modeled as a parent support, education, nutrition, and physical activity program. It was a recognition that there was a need for something, and that need wasn't being supported by the community. The broad direction was to look at children birth to 5, and a partnership was formed between Family Service Association, the Child Care Resource and Referral, the school district through their Strong Start program, the municipality through their Recreation Department, and the Child Development Association, just to mention a few. And this program had as its focus supporting healthy child development, physical activity, parent support and education through a very holistic community-based approach, and it was outside in a park to boot. So families participated in these activities, learned about active living, shared a nutritious lunch that was provided by a community partner in donation, while networking critically with other families from across the community. And what this leads to is a wonderful sense of community cohesion and interconnectedness between families across the community. This project is the result of the Success by Six Early Years Planning Council recognizing key gaps and needs and leveraging really what are the incredible abilities of partnership and collaboration, of realizing that there was a need to have a much more systematic response to this absence of supports in the summer, and that there needed all these partners. So the key aspects that it was focusing on are that need for a summertime parent support, and then once again reflecting the research provided by the Early Development Instrument that had revealed quite a significant vulnerability around infant gross motor skills in the community. So this was an answer that came from that collaborative agency partnership, and it represented a real victory for the early years agencies to work together to form a solution. So those are a few examples of exactly how this looks like, this process of communities coming together, of trying to find how they could take services and move into an integrative model of bringing things together, of working from a community-based approach but finding leadership to drive things forward, of including all aspects of the early years community, intervention, childcare, parent support, public health, just to mention a few, and to realize that to connect with families, there is a need for a wider range of options, of opportunities, of accessibility. So with that, I'll end my presentation and ask if there are any questions in particular about the partnership, the model of community development, or about these particular programs and others. I'd be happy to share with you models from across the province. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you, Joseph. That's a wonderful presentation and some very exciting activities and projects that you have underway. It's really interesting to see the diversity of partners involved in your early years councils and the good work that's come out of those collaborations. Certainly, we at the BC Healthy Living Alliance have always been big promoters of intersectoral collaboration, and they certainly draw on the strengths and they mobilize assets of diverse contributors, and that's certainly what you've been doing. So again, I'd like to ask our audience to send questions for Joseph, and just look at the question box at the bottom of your screen. We have a couple of questions. Oh, one, just if I could respond to, Anita is asking whether the slides will be available afterwards. Yes, they will. They'll be on our website at www.bchealthyliving.ca in a couple of days. Give us a few days to get organized. But further up, Cindy was asking, is Success by Six connected to all community early childhood development tables across British Columbia?
So to answer that question, in total there's approximately 120 early years tables across the province. In almost every case, funding through Success by Six is made available to those tables. And in most cases, there is an actual engagement of Success by Six community development coordination of those tables. Some are directly connected to the initiative, and some are associates and in partnership and supporting, allocating that funding.
Right, and you talked about how 550 communities are involved in Success by Six at this point? Mm-hmm. But different kinds of projects, different approaches, obviously, from what you've indicated.
Well, certainly that is the case. Lots of different approaches and lots of different projects. So what those look like are everything from recognizing a particular need or a gap, perhaps a need for childcare in a just off the top of my head, an interesting program was recognizing that while parents were trying to recover and to participate in recovery programs, there is a need for childcare supports, so those parents could participate. So in this case, it was a program that was supporting the children but also supporting the parents. So, so that's an example of a real community-based recognition of a support that was missing, and just a critical little piece that supported families in a more holistic way.
And Oshred is asking, how can we join this partnership? Would love to do the Hop with Me for parents and children and promote healthy living.
So, if we're thinking about joining the partnership, so there are these established community tables across the province. And if you're saying to yourself, I haven't heard of this table, or I'm not sure where it is, or who are these people, please connect with us at the Provincial Success by Six office, and we'll be quick to connect you with regional and area community coordinators whose role it is to bring together these inclusive partnerships. And if you're on this call, you're certainly wanted. These are very open tables, and their ambition is to bring leadership and direction, and to work together to formulate these plans and to prioritize, and to really move the dial, as it were, in terms of vulnerability in the early years. So if you're wondering at all about how to connect, please connect with us. Go to the Success by Six website, and you can see a map of how to connect to these people across the province as well.
And your website was on your last slide there. It's www.successby6bc.ca, and it'll be in the material that'll be available next week as well. Irv is asking if the program has been going on for, what, over 10 years now. Has it been evaluated?
So the key evaluations that take place are a yearly evaluation of how this community development process is progressing. So we call this the Community Capacity Provincial Evaluation. And what this does is reveal community by community, both from the perspective of the coordination and from the stakeholders that are sitting around the table, of how things are moving forward. So have we developed a strong strategic plan that reflects the research and our community needs? Do we have inclusive voices around the table that represent all the sectors of the early years? Have we developed a champion and a leadership team that is working together to integrate services and referral across the key aspects of health and education and children and family development? And have we brought on the municipality and their leadership and strength in supporting this? So that is the evaluation that takes place each year, and it shows us community by community and by province how this community process is evolving and developing and strengthening the resources around the province.
Now, June was wondering how long the credit unions have committed to continue funding.
So each year, the credit unions, membership, so let me start once again. The credit unions, through their members across the province, provide a dues levy. And that means that 90% of credit union members across the province are contributing each year. Every 3 years, the credit unions have at their annual general meeting, make a decision to recommit to the initiative financially, but much more significantly, on an individual level, each one of the credit unions that participate in the initiative yearly make their commitment that they will be participating, supporting, being part of these early years tables, doing local fundraising, and really acting as a conduit to the community in regard to public awareness and family friendliness in the early years.
Joseph, you mentioned service integration in your discussion of goals of Success by Six. Can you tell us what that might look like at a community level? And Joanne was asking that.
Well, it's a big question, and it looks very different in different communities. But when we're thinking about services integrated together, it's the idea that recognizing that families are coming from all sorts of different places. And when what we need to be trying to do as early years service providers is to create a web around them. So what that can look like in a particular model is, and I'll give you an example of early years screening. In this case, there is a recognition that across the province, we need to be trying to find ways to provide an opportunity for parents with children 2, 3, 4 years old to be able to have a very accessible opportunity to have their children screened in a wide diversity of health screening measures and assessments. So in order for that to happen, all the different services involved in screening, whether it be public health, early learning, early interventions, and developmental interventions and supports, having to come together to realize that in order to provide that screening and to provide the referral process seamlessly for parents, they needed to work together, create a system and a structure, a network around that service, and then to provide it in an accessible form across the region, so that ultimately every child is being assessed and screened to make sure that they are not developmentally delayed, and that that recognition is happening as early as possible.
And Anita has raised an issue, a concern that sometimes open tables chase away the decision makers because the managers feel they can't reallocate resources or plan strategically for program partnerships. Have you run into that problem?
Well, and that's a good question, and it's part of the, I guess, the richness of community development, that there are lots of different people at the table, and it's a conversation, and it's a building process. What we're realizing as we move forward in this evolution of early years community development in the province is that there is a critical role of leadership to be really changing the way that the services are working together and integrating together. So that often requires sometimes a different level of the individuals and the voices that are sitting around those tables. What that is looking like often is that we have tables that are focused around key gaps in services, of sharing of knowledge, of recognition, and then we have perhaps associated tables where we have what we might call more managerial level leadership who are trying to respond to those gaps recognized on the front line and trying to see how we can intersect key systems that are in place, whether that is the early learning system or the early health support system, and trying to make them work more seamlessly together.
And the final question that we'll have time for is, how are the health authorities involved with this? Rebecca was asking.
Well, I think anyone who's working in community recognizes that some of the most critical early support and early detection of delay is happening through public health nurses who are critically on the front line, who are meeting with families, talking with them, and referring them to services across the province. So what that certainly what that looks like is that public health is involved in these early years tables, is providing leadership in this model of community development and interconnectedness. So I would say that they're significant and primary in this process.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joseph. That's a fascinating presentation. And I know you have to leave us now, so I would like to extend our formal thanks and appreciation. And for those who would like follow-up, I'm sure they'll be in touch. And as we indicated, all that information will be on our website shortly as well. So
thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Move now to Dr. Mariana Bressoni. And Dr. Bressoni is a faculty member in the UBC Department of Pediatrics, as well as the School of Population and Public Health, and a scientist with the Child and Family Research Institute and the BC Injury Research and Prevention Unit. A very busy lady. Dr. Bressoni has a PhD in developmental psychology, and her research focuses on understanding the mechanisms of injury risk for high-risk populations and developing evidence-based policies, programs, and interventions. And Dr. Bressoni, I know so many are just excited about hearing your presentation, here to talk about the balance between risky play and healthy development.
Well, thank you for that intro, and it's really exciting to me to be able to talk to this group, and also if you can make sure that you keep connected with me after so that I can hear some of your questions and concerns. So before we begin, though, I want to go to the next slide, and I want to take you all back to your own childhood. So, you know, if you want to close your eyes, or if you want to just go drift off into that world a long time ago, what was your childhood like? And I want you to think about what couldn't you wait to do as a child. So you're so excited, you're getting outside. What is it that you're doing? Think about where you are, who you're with, what you might have learned from it, and also, very importantly, why was that so much fun? So I hope that you're all there at that place that gave you such great joy as a child. And so we'll go to the next slide, and I'm wondering how many of you thought that it looked like this. Or maybe, next slide, was it more like this? Or perhaps, next slide, like this. Or perhaps, in the next slide, if you didn't live in the Lower Mainland, something more like this. So I'd like to go to our first polling question and just get you to vote. So what do you think? Was it more like the first image, or the mud play, or the rope swing, or the snow fort? Okay, so 5% playground, and then we've got the mud play, the snow fort, the rope swing were very popular. Now, this is very typical about what we see. I ask this question a lot, and very few people are actually identifying the playground, which is children's primary play spaces these days, or our image of what they should be, as their favorite place. So if we can go back to the presentation, I want you now to think about, maybe there's a child in your own life, if you go to the next slide, a child, your own child, a niece, nephew, someone that you're close to, whatever that case may be, and I want you to think about what that child can't wait to get out to do. And whether these activities that this child is doing are similar to or different from the memories that you had as a child. And so we'll get to our next polling question. So if you could just vote whether they're the same or different. Okay, so 36% said the same, so that's great. 64% said different. And your answers here reflect what we're finding in the literature. So if we could go back to the presentation. There's one image, and I want to go to the next slide, which was just quite evocative, which gives people an indication of just how things have changed over time. So this is 4 generations of one family living in Sheffield, England. And so we go to great-grandfather George, who at age 8 in 1919 was allowed to walk 6 miles on his own to go fishing. His son Jack, at age 8 in 1950, was allowed to walk about 1 mile on his own into the woods. Now, Jack's daughter Vicky, in 1979, at age 8, was allowed to walk to the swimming pool about half a mile away from their home. Now, Vicky has a son named Ed, who's 8 right now, and he's allowed to go to the end of his street. Now, if you think that this is just an indicator of UK data, we're finding that the same thing is happening in North America. And in fact, some 8-year-olds aren't even allowed outside their own gate. So if we go to the next slide, I want to actually define for you, before we go on to the research, what I mean, because I'm going to be talking about risky play, what I mean by risky play. And there's a Norwegian researcher who's really led the field in this area. Her name is Ellen Sandseter, and she has defined risky play as thrilling and exciting forms of play that involve a chance of physical injury. And so in her research with children, she asked them what this meant for them, and they described things like it being scary and fun at the same time, thrilling, but you get a bit scared, tickling in the tummy. So she calls it like the scary, funny feeling, you know, where you're just at the edge, but you haven't quite lost control. So if we go to the next slide, there's 6 different kinds of risky play that she describes. So play at speed, play at height, play with dangerous tools, so saws, knives, things like that, play with dangerous elements like fire or water, rough and tumble play, so like play fighting, and play where there's a chance of getting lost. And again, here, you know, what you have to keep in mind is that a lot of this is in the eye of the child. So, you know, in the case of a toddler or a preschooler, they're hiding behind a bush, their caregiver knows exactly where they are, but they feel like they have that independence and privacy. So next slide, I think it's just as important to consider what isn't risky play. And so we need to be clear that what we're talking about is not neglect, so where there's not appropriate supervision to what that child requires for the situation that they're engaged in. It's not recklessness, where we're disregarding sources of danger or hazard, and it's not the promotion of hazards. And so, for example, the picture that's on this slide gives you an indication of what's not really, you know, that's not an example of risky play. That's just a hazard. So in the next slide, I want to differentiate a little bit more about what I mean between the difference between hazard and risk, because I think these are very important. So what we talk about as a hazard is something that the child may not be able to recognize for themselves, or they may not be able to deal with it themselves. So broken equipment on a playground would be an example, dirty needles, you know, in a river if there's a fast current. Those are examples of hazards or dangers. In contrast, a risk would be something that the child can recognize and can make a decision for themselves whether they want to engage in that. So, you know, a really tall slide or climbing a tree or those sorts of things, the child can figure out for themselves how they want to engage, how far they want to go in that risk, and what role they want you to play in supporting them. And so we talk about our work being focused on making children as safe as necessary, not as safe as possible. So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about why we think risky play is so important. The literature suggests that it promotes physical and motor competence, it promotes spatial orientation. If you think about how you're moving around the environment, you learn a lot about that. Environmental competence and appreciation for the environment, physical activity, and also reduces anxiety. And so I'm going to give you specifically, you know, we can talk more about each of these if you want, but what I want to turn to now in the next slide is actually a systematic review that we just published a couple of weeks ago in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. And with that review, we were interested in looking at the relationship between risky outdoor play and health in children. And so if we go to the next slide, this was a collaboration of researchers and NGOs all across Canada that were very concerned about this issue, as well as Ellen Sandseter herself in Norway. So if we go to the next slide, I'm not going to bore you with the details here, but essentially, for those of you who aren't familiar with the systematic review process, what you do is you try and look as far across the literature as possible, make your search terms as wide as possible to capture what you're looking for, and then you winnow that down based on your specific criteria to the articles that will answer your question. So we went from 2,100 records down to, at the end of the day, we had 21 articles representing 8 studies that we were able to include in our systematic review. And if we go to the next slide, I'm going to go kind of straight to the punchline. So we found articles that dealt with play getting lost, play at height, rough and tumble play, and also risky play supportive environments. And what we found was that over all of those studies, risky play related to health in a positive direction. So we saw an increase in physical activity, a decrease in sedentary behavior, and an increase in social health and behavior for kids who were allowed to engage in some of these forms of risky play. Now, more importantly, what we didn't find is negative impacts of risky play on children's health. So if we go to the next slide, on the same day that we released this systematic review, and we released another one that was also about outdoor time specifically, Participaction released their report on children's physical activity levels in Canada. And you may have heard of it on that day or the days subsequent, but if you haven't, I would encourage you to go to the Participaction website to have a look at that report, because it has some really great information in it. And embedded as part of that report was a position statement that we worked on, and I'll get you to go to the next slide, on active outdoor play. And so it's a 4-page position statement with a lot of details in terms of why we say, what the evidence behind it is, and specific recommendations that, again, I would encourage you to have a look at on the Participaction website. We also published a peer-reviewed article in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, which outlines the process that we went through and the evidence behind it. And these are freely accessible, so you could just go onto the journal website and find these and be able to download them. And so the position statement itself says that access to active play in nature and the outdoors with its risks is essential for healthy child development. We recommend increasing children's opportunity for self-directed play outdoors in all settings, at home, at school, in childcare, the community, and nature. So next slide. This is the groups that sat around together at a table hammering out this position statement. And then what it was done was it was sent out to wider consultation, and over 1,600 people replied to that. So next slide. The key recommendation, there's lots of recommendations there, and I'll just list some here. So promote natural elements over prefabricated playgrounds. Don't restrict to the use of CSA standards, Canadian Standards Association standards. Establish reasonable liability limits for municipal governments, and examine existing policies and bylaws and reconsider those that pose a barrier to active outdoor play. And I'm happy to go through these in more detail during the question period. If we go to the next slide, if you are interested in this and possibly supporting it, I would encourage you to go to haloresearch.ca/outdoor play, where you can actually endorse for yourself the position statement. Next slide. I also wanted to point people to the importance of this document. It's a risk-benefit assessment, and what it represents is really a new way of thinking about how we look at children's play, so that we're not just looking at the risks of something happening, but we're also of something negative happening, but we're also balancing that with all of the good things that kids get out of this. And in this document, there's a form that shows you how to do that, and in fact, the health executive in the UK has endorsed this form and recommends its use. So I'll stop there, and final slide has my contact information, and I'll open it to questions.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Mariana. That's fascinating. I mean, this is the idea of like popping the bubble wrap and encouraging risky active play has really been taking off, and it's so interesting to see all the partnerships that you have there. And I know you're speaking to a national audience later this afternoon on the same topic. So it seems like there's going to be quite a bit of a cultural shift to bring back play, and it's great that discussion is happening. I know several people have asked whether they can get a link to your report. I think it's in your slides, isn't it?
Well, so the position statement itself is on the Participaction website.
Right.
So if you go to the Participaction website, you know, even if you Google Participaction, either report card or position statement, the position statement is on its own, and it's also embedded within the report card, so you can get it either way.
And your study that you talked about.
Right.
Journal.
Yes, the study is on the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. And so you can Google that with risky play, and you will uncover it. You'll also might uncover the outdoor play systematic review, as well as the process position statement paper. So again, it's the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, and you should find all of those papers easily accessible there.
Well, Anita's wondering, how do we persuade municipal decision makers to measure the benefit of risk? I mean, I know in boards I sit on now, we're constantly talking about the need to do risk assessments and things like that, but we don't think about it the other way around, that some risks are acceptable. So how do we get municipal folks to start thinking maybe a little bit differently rather than just always minimizing any risk or eliminating any risk?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and they're worried about liability, of course, which is why we recommend one of our recommendations is to reform the liability laws. But I guess I have a couple of things to say about that. First of all, I've actually been very encouraged by the reaction of municipalities to our work and to the statement. Now, they do need education, and we do a lot of this sort of thing. But when they hear about it, they do get very excited. And importantly, when I talk to risk managers at municipalities, they kind of get a bad rap. People think that they shouldn't do stuff because the risk managers will tell them not to. But risk managers are actually there to try and figure out a way to do things, not to figure out a way to stop doing things. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to not make assumptions, and also to do some pushing back. And sharing of materials like the participation report card, which goes into great detail about the evidence, so that we're not making decisions based on liability or anxiety, but actually putting the child at the center of these decisions, which is exactly where they should be.
And what about for parents? Are there resources that can help parents be able to have a better understanding of risky play and the advantages and what might, some of the things you talked about? How do you reach parents?
Yeah, we're working on that. We're in the process of developing a resource to be available online that will be very interactive. It's taking some time, and we also need to properly fund it. At this point in time, the participation material, they've done it so that it is fairly readable and user-friendly. And what we do in our own work is we try and encourage parents to put a filter on their decision making. So right now what we find is that decisions are being made based on anxiety. So we call it anxiety-based caregiving. Parents are worried about all of the negative things that could happen, and that ratchets up their anxiety, and they don't think clearly about what their kids might be missing out from not being able to engage in these activities. And so what we encourage is, okay, put aside your anxiety decision making, and we know it's easier said than done, but think about competence-based decision making. So what's my child's competence? Why don't I just step back and watch for a bit and see what they actually need, and think about this issue from their perspective rather than from an anxiety perspective.
And you mentioned earlier in your presentation that you've done some work in this area, but in terms of the emotional and mental health aspects of development related to risky play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is quite interesting. There's a couple of issues here. So first of all, we find research that, if parents are worried, say, about the safety of their neighborhood or kids being outside or those sorts of things, those anxieties get transmitted to the children, and it will affect the children's desire to go outside and their feeling of safety in the world. The second point that's related to that is Ellen Sansitter's work, which also indicates that, so phobias, they're quite natural at different parts of development. So for example, at about 12 months you get the separation anxiety phobia. You have height-related phobias and those sorts of things that pop up actually quite naturally, and there's a reason for those. But there's also a reason for kids being able to engage in activities that help lessen those phobias. And if they're not allowed to do that, then those phobias may not go away. So, if they don't have time away from caregivers where they're experiencing independence and making their own decisions, they may not be able to realize that's a good thing and they're okay and they can actually think for themselves and navigate for themselves. And if they don't have an opportunity to climb trees and figure out that they can manage heights and at what point they can manage those heights, then they may not be able to get rid of those phobias. So that there's quite a few linkages, as well as when we look at research with college students who have parents who are rated as being hyper parents, which is not a great term, but it's, it denotes kind of really being involved in their child's caregiving. Those college students tend to have higher rates of anxiety and depression because they haven't been able to kind of been given the freedom to navigate the world by themselves. So we see that there's a lot of actually really important linkages there with mental health and well-being.
That's really interesting. As a new grandmother, I can appreciate all of this.
I can imagine.
Is there any research, in fact, a follow-on, is there any research about the key development windows for developing competencies like for risky play?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, and there's more and more research on brain development and ideal periods, but we don't have that yet. Nor, and like most activities, it should be a gradual thing, and it's probably, earlier is better. But I don't really want to say that either, because I don't want people to think, well, my kid never got that opportunity, and so he's toast. Or, that's not the case. Everybody can start somewhere. And what I would encourage people to do is to think about the child's competence, and thinking about what can my child be capable of, stepping back a bit and just letting them try things out. But also being cognizant that, for example, people often ask me, at what age can my child walk to school by themselves? Well, it's not necessarily an age-related thing, because it's related to, it's not like between your 8th and 9th birthday all of a sudden you turn 9 and everything's in place to figure out how to cross busy streets. Well, no, you also have to gradually build up to that. You have to train the child. They have to realize what's out there and how to navigate the world. And so like anything, there's a building up process to the point at which, you're comfortable that your child can manage that, as well as you have to keep into account the neighborhood, the environment. So, does the child have to cross a lot of really busy streets to get to school? Well, that's going to be different than a child who's in a fairly sedate residential neighborhood.
Right, and I think Anita comments that your comments for parents, anxiety-based versus competence-based decisions goes for organizations too. I think that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think we have time for just a final question from Priscilla, and she comments how the socioeconomic status of families and communities plays a part in parents' ability for accepting risky play. And so have you noticed in your study the difference with rural and urban access and willingness, and then specifically Aboriginal on and off reserve?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those are great questions, and we don't necessarily have the answers for those. I did do some previous research with families in urban and rural areas, and there are differences in approach to this issue. Families in rural areas tend to feel more comfortable and safer letting their kids out. Although there's other issues that come into play there. At this point, I don't have those kinds of details or information. As it relates to Aboriginal populations, a lot of these ideas actually resonate with Aboriginal populations because of their feeling about, their relationship with the land and those sorts of things. And so, we need to do a bit more to explore, the interaction there and how this might work with Aboriginal populations.
Great. Well, I know you have to leave us, Mariana, as well, because you're going on to do another presentation, but I just want to thank you so much. I think you've raised some issues that many of us are thinking about, not necessarily sure of the answers, but the research and the work that you're doing is going to be so tremendously helpful in being able to move forward in getting children active and outdoors and taking acceptable risks. So great work, and it was wonderful to have you as part of our webinar today, Mariana.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation, and please keep in touch.
Will indeed. So I'd like to move on now to our final presenter, someone I'm sure many of you know, Dr. P.J. Naylor. PJ, as we call her, is a researcher in the University of Victoria School of Exercise Science, Physical and Health Education, the public health focus, and she conducts research on chronic disease and obesity in children. She looks at real-world environments where children live, learn, and play, and she also, again, is an international expert and scholar. So, PJ, we're delighted to have you, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much for having me, and I really enjoyed the two speakers before, so it's fun to follow it. We've been doing some kindergarten research on physical motor skill development, and we know there's this window of opportunity, and we're finding it's bigger than we think, where they feel fantastic about themselves. So we used to think it was really young, so I really enjoyed hearing Mariana's stuff and thinking about these things as it relates to child care and school and the provision of physical activity opportunities. Apologize for the typo on my first slide that I just noticed, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about whole setting approaches to promoting physical activity, physical literacy, and healthy eating. And we were very lucky. Joseph talked about Hop With Me, and also Mariana about outdoor play and things that we can do. So wrapping those ideas into how do we get it done and how do we approach it. Next slide. So I just wanted to set the stage just a little bit, because you see from the picture, that's what we assume is happening in early childhood, in early childhood. And it absolutely isn't. We've already got 21.5% of preschool age children, 2 to 5, overweight or obese. And unfortunately, these children are more likely to become overweight and obese as older children than adolescents, and then it tracks forward. Data already shows that very few of our 3 to 4-year-old Canadian children meet the physical activity and sedentary behavior guidelines. Next slide. If we flip the coin related to diet, we know that 71% of 4 to 8-year-old children eat less than the recommended minimum number of servings of fruit and vegetables. And the next slide. And when some of our child care research with my colleague Viv Temple and others in our department, we have looked at, say, in the family child care environment, children are spending a lot of time in child care. On average, we found if they're there 7 hours per day in care. And what's really notable is less than 14 minutes of that is at a level more than a walk of intensity, and there's a lot of sedentary activity going on. You see about 46% of that time is spent sedentary. So not only do our assumption that kids are always moving is wrong, but some of the environments in which they're in, there is a lot of sedentary time and not that much moderate, vigorous time. Next slide. And this becomes critical as we're talking about risky play, that we know enhancing fundamental movement skills, can't catch, won't play. If they already don't have the basic skills to move, it becomes problematic later on. We know that low engagement with manipulative skills like striking and hitting and catching and throwing and is predictive of engagement in physical activities in the future in the teen years. So it starts to become critically important what's happening in this age group. Next slide. And because we're talking about early childhood development, funnily enough, physical activity and healthy food really relate to brain and overall development. And next slide. And not only just the brain, but mental health and social health. Physical activity and healthy eating are how we engage and connect with the world, and also how we control our emotions and deal with stress, anxiety, and depression. So it becomes really important that we deal with physical activity and healthy eating in the early years when habits are forming, because it's hard to remediate this stuff even in childhood years. it becomes more and more difficult to deal with things like overweight, inactivity, and sedentary habits. Next slide. So where are we moving to when we're dealing with the settings where these young children are spending their time? And we are moving to more of the recommendation of really addressing a whole setting and comprehensive approach. And it's based on the socio-ecological model and our deepening understanding that individuals are embedded and influenced by others in a variety of contexts. And the influence is reciprocal. The individual child also influences these contexts, and you can start to see it move forward. So if a child spends a lot of time through their family or their childcare habits sedentary and using screen time, and then they move into the school system or after school, and they're asked what they would like to do, they start to influence what happens and what they're provided access to. Next slide. So when we look at it deeper, if we're talking about an early learning setting, I might call it a child care setting, but it doesn't just have to be child care. It can be family resource settings and things. We start to see the early learning setting has its own set of influences. There's a physical environment. Are you backing onto a forest with a path? Are you an urban child care setting? There's rules and policies we enact in those places which talk about risk and things like that. Then there's the practices of the child care provider and of the group of child care providers, what the manager of that setting believes is important, what kind of funding is available to provide healthy snacks. And then we have this right relationship between the family and the setting and the child and the family, and in the middle of that is a health intermediary called the child care provider, who are influenced by their early learning setting, but also influence the family and child. So you start to see it's quite complex. Next slide. And then we look at where are we starting to talk, and we have a lot of proof around these whole setting, multi-component models, comes from our interventions in the school. And there's 3 health promoting areas that Stuart Brown found in a health evidence network where we have pretty substantive proof that this approach works, and they're in the areas of physical activity, healthy eating, and mental health. It's important to note that even though we're talking whole setting and multi-component models in the school-based setting, that most, it's a bit ideation, a bit philosophical, in that most interventions don't achieve full coverage across all strategies that we might consider whole setting. But some of the things we know from the Comprehensive School Health is these type of approaches engage school stakeholders. So if we take that to the child care environment, that the better approaches are starting to engage child care providers and child care managers and parents, and that they recognize the importance of local context. So one size never fits all. One school or one child care might be doing really great on physical activity, but they're not that confident in providing the healthy snack. I've run into a child care setting where they had people with their chef licenses that were just experimenting with organic farm-to-school salads for the kids in, say after school care, but they weren't dealing with their physical activity. And so their strengths and capacity based on who they have working for them, what their setting is. But we do know that when we take these approaches, we're working on multiple strategies and multiple avenues. It's almost like a series of settings or strategies that are used. And some of the ones we know work, and we're also seeing the similarities to early learning, is that providing physical activity breaks, like physically doing it, not teaching about it, providing healthy snacks, physically involving ourselves with food. There is often integration of curriculum or lessons. We're less curricularized in our early childhood development sites in some places in the States, but there has to be some teaching. And then engaging family and community in it, and then looking at the policies and what's really guiding practice. The funny thing about the school environment, it does have some very many similarities to the early learning setting, in that you do have in some level some professionals who have the capacity and understanding of how to set up a learning environment. So when you can go in and provide professional development, and they can bring their skills and abilities and capacities to it. We also have those sort of managerial staff responsibilities that are the same, and you also have to integrate the family into that whole picture. So lots of similarities between the early childhood setting and what's going on in schools. And so we take what we've learned in schools about these whole settings and these multi-component models, and we're starting to see them emerge in early learning settings. Next slide. So we conducted a review of reviews in 2010 to 2011. We looked at systematic reviews, and we looked at all the types of things that were going on related to physical activity, obesity, healthy eating across the world. But one of the things that we started to see in the systematic reviews is some evidence that we're not just talking now. We know we can see an effect on if we train childcare providers to teach fundamental movement skills and playful activities that build them, that we'll see a response. As a matter of fact, we have a group in Ontario that we're involved with, Christy Adamo and Gary Goldfield, that just piloted the training and professional development and the HOP manual to deal with early childhood settings, childcare, and we're starting to see changes in their fundamental movement quotient. And in reality, in the review we did in 2010 to 2011, we can work on these single focus strategies, but we started to see things like, well, you better deliver them in partnership with teachers and leaders. You need to choose your program facilitators carefully because they have to have the capacity. You need to involve parents and underpin with these larger frameworks. And then another review by Ward and Hales reviewed 19 studies on physical activity and motor skill development and found that a lot of them were focusing on this education curricular approach. That's because they're in the States. They tend to curricularize. But only 2 out of 5 of those that they reviewed had a positive influence on physical activity. And then we started to see a bunch of studies emerging where they take on environmental approaches, like adding physical activity to the day, about 1 to 1.5 hours per week. Adding equipment. There's even some European groups that have started to just take that school-based playground markings and putting out equipment and seeing the effect they have in the childcare. And 8 out of 8 of those type of approaches where they started to integrate environment saw positive impacts on physical activity, and 5 out of 5 on motor skills. So we start to see in these reviews that childcare researchers and partners are starting to expand their vision of what will really work beyond just telling people, oh kids, we've got to eat healthy, don't we? Oh, here's our 5 fruit and vegetables. And it's more snacking on those types of things. There is consistent evidence, though, at least on the whole literature, that at least on 1 or 2 health outcomes, they see impacts on physical activity, on healthy eating, on screen time. Less impact on BMI, although there are some. We see lots of impact from structure physical activity on fundamental movement skill and bone, and at the micro level. At this level, we started to see what did multi-component look like. It engages parents. There's outdoor playtime. There's adult facilitation. There's at least 30 minutes of structured and 60 minutes of unstructured play, limits on screen time, and integrating healthy eating into what they do. Next slide. So I did actually want to ask a question of everybody, and I apologize for this, Brenda, if you could put up my poll question. How many of you are familiar with some of the things that have gone on in British Columbia or across Canada? I've got a couple listed here, and if you just tick all the ones that you think you've heard of or been experiencing. Yeah, so a lot of people are familiar with the LEAP resources, Healthy Opportunities for Preschoolers, Food Flare. Knapsack is an American one I'm going to talk about. I know up in the north they did I Am Moving, I Am Learning. So great. So people are familiar with some of the resources that still exist in some of the child care resource and referral, and there's people and trainers that were trained during the 2008 to 2010 that are probably, we know, are still operating and dealing with HOP. So, okay, back to the slides. So I just wanted to, I plucked a few examples that are more whole of setting approaches. Romp and Chomp is an Australian initiative, and what I find really interesting after Joseph's Success by 6 strategy, this very clearly aligned with that type of approach. They focused on capacity building, increasing leadership, and it was targeting community and the settings within the community, largely did focus on large childcare, family childcare, mother and tot programming, maternal health programming. So they were targeting those type of groups as community, but they also went straight at the parents. And what I wanted, the list of what they did was so long, I just want to talk to you about it. They had 6 objectives. They wanted to increase capacity in the organizations, like a Success by 6 approach, to deal with healthy eating and physical activity. They focused on families. They looked at sugary drinks. They looked at energy-dense snacks, promoting physical activity, structured physically active play, and things like that. They took a social marketing approach. They had some key messages around, you know, be more active, play outside, less screen time, more fruit and vegetables, drink water as your drink of choice. So very much like what we're doing in Canada. But then they went at a communication plan, social marketing. They created postcards for parents. They released posters, postcards, and brochures through all the early childhood care settings. They provided resources and toolkits to the kindergartens in the area. And then the community health professionals came in and started to focus on helping them identify key strategies. They distributed water bottles to all the kindergarten in the areas and lunch bags. And then they created sugary drink demonstrations for the kindergartens to show children and also deal with their family sugary drinks. They released an outdoor play strategy. They provided sample policies for child care providers, so including consultation with staff. So they looked at energy-dense snack policies, fruit and veg policies, so they could shop among those, as well as structured play policies and overall health and wellness. And then instead of reinventing the wheel, which I want to talk about, we're doing this in Canada as well, they took existing strategies that were going on. So they had Smiles for Miles, which is a more dental health, focusing on sugary drinks and sugary sticky fruit. And they went with the Go for Life program, which is about physical activity and healthy eating. So they started to integrate programs that were really underway, created parent newsletters for the child care providers. And then a lot of professional development in those settings. So it starts to be this broader capacity building approach, working with the healthy intermediary, working with multiple risk or health behaviors, and then multiple strategies, reaching out to the parents directly through the child care, training up the child care providers and providing a lot of resources to them, and policy examples so they could take action. If we go to the next slide, the other one I wanted to talk about a little bit is NAPSAC, which is an American initiative, and it comes from a sort of more of an assessment approach, starting with this tool, a self-assessment, that asks about physical activity and healthy eating policies, asks about what physical infrastructure they have available for cooking, for snacking, for eating peacefully, for group eating, for outdoor play, what types of equipment they have, what rules and practices, do they provide training for their staff. And the staff do the self-assessment and then are taken through an action planning process. So those of you who are familiar with Action Schools, which is a school-based initiative focusing on comprehensive school health, we start from this in comprehensive school health with the self-assessment. And then they provide professional development for the child care providers to increase their confidence to make those changes. They deal with providing policy examples, templates, toolkits, and training. And this, again, is an evidence-based approach where they know that child care centers that have completed the NAPSAC components improve their nutrition and physical activity policies and their day-to-day practices. So those are 2 examples where they're starting to broaden out to a more holistic approach that involves environment, involves parents, definitely builds capacity for child care providers, and deals with those type of issues. Next slide. There's all sorts of other promising approaches that start to look promising. This is an American one, Tutti Frutti Veggie. They enhance access to water, nutrition policy, parent newsletter and tips, fruit and vegetable tasting, cooking classes, and fundamental movement skill sessions for the kids. And now remember, this isn't just go training kids to roll. This is play and learning through play. There's an initiative down the state that tends to focus more on really managing children's overweight, but it's called Mighty Moves and Food Friends. They're both copyrighted initiatives, but they're collaborating around, and it's a social marketing approach where they're creating exciting food friend images and moving images and communicating with parents and working with the child care to provide those opportunities. Related to physical activity only, there's something called the Magic Trial in Glasgow, where they just started to provide 3 30-minute sessions of physical activity a week. They trained their staff, they sent home a home element, they did health education leaflets, and posters displayed at what they call nurseries. So we start to see these more comprehensive approaches creeping in, and I could name a million more. There's Munch and Crunch and Munch, another one in Australia. There is some Catch Kids and Spark programs that are only physical activity focused. So there's lots of opportunities and lots of resources, and they're starting to take these broader whole setting approaches. Next slide. So we also did a review of what resources were out there. So this is a little bit old, but what was really interesting is we do a lot of producing resources and some really good work in Canada. You see here the Alberta Snacktivity Box, Kids Can Move. A lot of these are physical activity orientated. We've got the LEAP BC resource, which also had Food Flair for childcare, Mothers in Motion. If we go to the next slide, we start to see some more integrative ones, Tumblebugs, Activate, Busy Bodies, Eat Right from Ontario. So in Canada, we have done a lot of work creating resources for parents or parents and childcare providers that you can go to. Not a lot of evidence about them. They're more practitioner-based. There's some phenomenal policy and care provider training going on in Quebec right now. But so we see that there are, we're doing a lot of the work of defining and providing the stuff we need, the information about the content, but there aren't as many whole of setting approaches yet out there in the literature. Next slide. So through the Coalition for Action on Childhood Obesity, we did take this move towards these broader whole setting approaches, and a bunch of collaborators across Canada through class funding created the Healthy Beginnings for Preschoolers 2 to 5 toolkit and training. And one of the key focuses we did, we said, okay, it obviously should be whole setting. What does the setting look like? And so this is how we've defined it as an example of a Canadian initiative where we actually put in guidelines for what should happen during a child care day. What do they need to do? How many minutes of structured or unstructured? Should they provide fundamental movement skill play twice a week at least? What kind of practices are there? So we started to say there's so many good resources in Canada, we're not going to reinvent. So we pointed people to existing resources like HOP activities, like Snacktivity Box activities. And then we talked about environment. What does the eating environment look like? What's available for play? And then family connections. We provide some newsletters, some messaging, 5210 for the families. So that's the approach we have started to take here in British Columbia and across Canada on Healthy Beginnings, and trying to integrate all these existing things and give people more of a framework to take action. It's based on 5210, so we do look at fruit and veg, sugary drinks, screen time, physical activity, and fundamental movement skills. If you go to the next slide, and mostly we're doing what the rest of the literature is looking like. We're providing professional development. We've been told it needs to be interactive and experiential. So when you come to a Healthy Beginnings workshop, just like the HOP workshops, you will be doing the activities so you feel confident about them. And then we have some online paper toolkit, and we connect, and each different jurisdiction, like the Yukon, Northwest Territories, they can insert their own guidelines, their own toolkits, their own resources into them, and we try to make it at your fingertips. So we do a bit of a toolkit so that, you know, you can find some ideas right here, all drawn out for you, and then of course parent resources. So when we went out to train on Healthy Beginnings, we find that the training in physical activity and screen time positively influenced, oh, next slide, sorry, practitioner knowledge and confidence in their ability to improve the child care setting. They leave the training intending to use and implement what they learned. Most of the practitioners found the training to be very useful, and also that it provided some new information, just like if we integrate this risky play information. And really, the practitioners really liked to have some guidelines to follow because it made it so much easier for them to understand and implement changes and communicate with parents. So they learned a little bit about unhealthy messaging directed towards children because we had a marketing to children aspect. They can learn new activities, the benefits and the recommended amount of daily physical activity they should be providing, and they find resources helpful for putting together weekly plans and incorporating new activities and training staff. So next slide. I think that's my last slide. Yes, sorry. So in summary, we've been taking on these whole sitting approaches. We don't have to have a one-size-fits-all approach, but we do need to deal with all of those influences when we're talking about a whole setting approach that affect the setting, like guidelines, like staff skills and abilities and feelings of competence and capacity, like our connection with parents, and like dealing with the physical environment.
Okay, well, thank you, PJ. That was certainly a tour de force of not only British Columbia, Canada, and the world in terms of what's going on. I'm just wondering, going back to Mariana's presentation, are you incorporating into any of these activities or programs or policies the risky play concepts?
Well, you know what's interesting about that, we do talk about outdoor and unstructured at least an hour. And we're starting to talk about physical literacy things, but no, the risky concepts, we're just a little ahead of that movement. But what's interesting is the toolkits are mobile for every jurisdiction, so people can put in as things come up. That's how we've done. We're not reinventing resources, we're just incorporating. So as resources happen, and the second thing in British Columbia, we're very lucky because the physical activity and healthy eating strategies have been developed with consultation. And there, I know that the early childhood environment is a key area, and there will be work, I suspect, on those, on mobilizing more resources in this area. And so we probably have a window of opportunity, actually.
Right. I think that's we certainly support that. I know. Yeah, Anita just wondered, is the Healthy Beginnings training still available? I was wondering about that too.
Yes, it is, and we're starting to partner. Childhood Obesity Foundation and the Coalition, the Canadian Cancer Society are partnering to start to spread it out. So if you do want to reach people for the Healthy Beginnings stuff before any new provincial resources come out, you can contact Vanessa Morley at the Childhood Obesity Foundation, and I'll send the web link to Brenda.
Okay, and we'll put it on our webpage.
Yeah.
And Lynn was saying they just had the Scope Live 521 in her community. And what is your connection, as you'd mentioned, of course, the 5210?
Oh, yes. So 5210 is a messaging that started in the U.S., and we've taken it on, and Scope is really embedding those messages. I'm involved in Scope, and Scope nicely fits with the Success by Six story. It's much more of a community mobilization around children's obesity and physical activity. So yes, I think that messaging, that's why we also targeted those. What are the key health behaviors that we need to worry about in a child care setting? And 5210, although that's the broader all day long, and some of those aren't specific to early childhood, for instance, the amount of unstructured play we talk about having in early childhood is far greater than 1 hour, which deals with childhood and adulthood. But the bottom line is it's that idea of we need to deal with fruit and veg, we need to deal with sugary drinks, we need to deal with screen time, sedentary behavior, and we need to deal with physical activity. So it is a nice framework, and I think it's a way for a community to coalesce and work around. And that's why the Healthy Beginnings Toolkit just took that approach, although it wasn't as, we didn't make it as overt in the toolkit because not all jurisdictions, like in British Columbia, 5210 has a lot of traction. And whereas in other jurisdictions, say that we're developing the toolkit, it wasn't as recognized and people felt it might confuse. But I do like it to bring communities together on keeping focused on what do we mean by some of the healthy living things that we have to deal with.
Good. Well, thank you, PJ. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time for this webinar, But so I would just like to thank you, PJ, and our other presenters, Mariana and Joseph, for the great presentations. As we've mentioned, we will have them on our website within the next few days, so you can follow up with that. We'll also be sending out a short survey to everyone, and we hope you'll respond, as that really helps us learn and what we could be doing better even in the future. And of course, we'll be continuing with our webinar series, so watch your inbox for our fall webinar. In the meantime, I thank everyone again, the participants and everyone who's been online. We look forward to having you join us again, and in the meantime, have a very happy, healthy, and fun summer. Take care.